When Greece's Syriza party was voted into power last week, the media narrative was already in place, since all of the polls had indicated that Alexis Tsipras would be the next prime minister. So the headline writers were ready, with pronouncements that a party from the radical left would bring the country to ruin and possibly take the rest of Europe down with it. In one way, Syriza did make it easy for them. The party's name is an acronym that translates to the Coalition of the Radical Left. But once you get past the label and look at the policies, are they that radical? Ever since the first days of the financial crisis back in 2008, the consensus in much of the mainstream news media, the vast majority of which is corporate-owned, has been that harsh, even brutal austerity measures are something that Greeks simply must live with. This past week, Syriza has been chipping away at that line of thinking. The party's frontman in this debate is Yanis Varoufakis, its new finance minister. Ostensibly, his whistleblowing tour was built around meetings with European finance ministers. But it was also designed for the news media, and it was no mere charm offensive. Varoufakis was out to subvert financial doctrines, as well as dress codes, and was dealing out sound bites that turned into broadsides, slamming into the walls of conventional economic thinking, particularly in Germany, where this debate about Greece may be won or lost. For a change, our starting point this week is not a dateline. It's a newsmaker, the academic come politician who's out to teach Europe a thing or two about economics. At the risk of starting with a point that may seem trivial but really isn't, when is the last time a news audience watched a story about finance and debt, featuring terms like the IMF, default, and restructuring, in which one of the principals, the new Greek finance minister, isn't wearing a tie or a suit, let alone pinstripes?
Yanis Varoufakis has a very distinct approach to this whole thing by showing up in very casual clothing with a very specific message. Says, look, I'm not here to talk nonsense. I don't care about being admitted to your European club of finance boys. I have a very specific proposal. This is what we need to do. Greece is insolvent. Our debt is impossible to repay. And this is what we need to do.
So that the self-perpetuating crisis of the last 5 years can be put to an end.
He's speaking in English. He arrives without a press guy. He doesn't have security. This is totally new. He is able to communicate not just substance, there is also form.
Is Greece committed to staying in the Eurozone?
You see, the problem is that once you're in, just like you will recall the Eagles song, Hotel California, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave.
Although, German politicians or the German administration, or in, some cases our editorial views may not be too happy about what he's doing there, I fully understand what he's doing. And I find his energy, his charm, his openness impressive, I have to admit. I think he has a good chance of succeeding in building a coalition and alliance that will, support what he wants.
Yet Varoufakis and his party have been given a torrid time by the biggest selling newspaper in Europe, Bild, the German tabloid, which wields influence in a country at the heart of this story. Among its headlines, will the triumph of the Euro scare cost us billions? No mercy for the Greeks. And Bild called Prime Minister Tsipras the Euro horror.
I would strongly contest the view that we are being fearmongers. We believe that it is not our job to tell freely elected government of Greece what to do, but we are also free to question who's going to pick up the bill for their decisions, and that is what we are always trying to point out in our coverage, that yes, Greece can decide that they want higher pensions, but they have to come up with a convincing, credible plan who's going to pay for it.
That's like the official government line of thought that is reflected in a lot of German mainstream media. At Spiegel Online, we really tried to dig into the policies of this movement, and we found out that it's much more complex than it's portrayed in German or Western mainstream media.
If you're living in Germany and you're working your tail off and you're watching what's going on in Greece, what are you supposed to think?
It's not just let's give up austerity and let's start spending. It's also about, let's broaden the tax base, let's make our path of growth more sustainable in Greece.
Media love talking in terms of binary oppositions, and they don't like complex pictures. And obviously the two extreme binaries that were chosen to tell the story about the crisis was Germany and Greece. Again, it is interesting to see how the Syriza win might change this narrative and putting the blame not on the lazy Greeks but on the evil Germans that don't want to take lessons from their history and how their debt was reduced or wiped off actually after the Second World War.
The economics of this story are complex, well beyond the understanding of many of the political or general assignment reporters covering it, and the details remain vague. But what Syriza is saying is this. It clearly wants to delay the repayment schedule, although we don't know by how long. It also wants the schedule and the size of those payments linked to the future growth of Greece's GDP, its gross domestic product. And Syriza says it will refuse to abide by the conditions that the previous Greek government accepted from its lenders. The austerity plan that would cap the minimum wage, privatize public sector assets, and put a lid on government hiring. However, the news media are addicted to conflict, and it's much easier to sell or capture that in a headline than actually crunching the numbers and examining the economics behind a new policy.
So an example of this conflict narrative can be seen in the headline that Bloomberg had just the day before the Greek election. And it was a headline that said something along the lines that Europe is waiting while the Greeks are deciding between a reform path or defiance. And you can see there is a clear-cut distinction between reform that has positive connotations and defiance to create this kind of like fear-mongering campaign against voting for Syriza.
The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Bloomberg, those guys who are covering the debt aspect of Greece, in general, being able to use the right language with each stage of the Greek debt renegotiation story. I think the world's news media has been less clear in understanding that there are no more rules. The story has everything, but I still do think that the mainstream media is struggling to understand it.
Then there's the ideological side. Then there's the inevitability of capitalism, the inevitability of neoliberalism. The idea that a sovereign state cannot go against the markets because the markets are all-knowing. And journalists who have grown up in this, have been trained in this, have been educated in this context, can't see beyond it.
I see these ranks of economics and finance guys with their suits still pressed from Davos, standing on the hotel balconies, ranting about what's going on. It's not a finance story. It's a social and psychological revolution that's begun and will not stop.
There's an old saying that goes, if you owe the bank a little money and you can't pay, you're in trouble. If you owe a lot and you can't pay, the bank's in trouble. Europe, in this case, is part bank, part Hotel California. Greece knows it can never really leave. That makes the two sides more partners than adversaries. But in journalism, an industry with its own economic problems, conflict sells. And news outlets no doubt fear that if they toned down the conflict angle that they've been playing up,
there seems to be a lot of ambiguity in what you're saying.
Circulation might decline, as would ratings. And the insolvency story the media would be looking at might be their own. On the download this week, our viewers on the way the Greek story is being reported outside the country.
The effect of the victory of Syriza on mainstream European media was quite shocking, I think. Of course, there is no unanimity about Syriza, but the main news outlets in the large European countries have adopted an attitude that varied from cold indifference to frank hostility since Syriza appeared in the European scene. To be honest, I think that many European journalists working for mainstream media believe their own spin about the crisis that can be resumed as follows: there is no alternative to austerity.
The problem is not so much a particular internalized economic doctrine, but an additional utter lack of context. If Greece is insolvent, then further repayment is a disciplining device. The tool is the austerity program, which produces real suffering, enormous unemployment, and huge social costs. All of this is often left out.